There are secrets that a man usually carries to his grave, buried under layers of shame and rationalization. And then there are truths so blindingly bright that keeping them hidden becomes a sin greater than any crime I have ever committed. My name is Captain Alessandro Fortuna. I am 47 years old, and for 23 of those years, I commanded steel giants across the stratosphere, first for Alitalia and later for ITA Airways. I was a man of science, of checklists, of aerodynamic laws that do not bend for prayers or desperation. I lived my life by the altimeter and the artificial horizon, trusting only what I could touch, measure, and control. But what occurred in the pre-dawn darkness of June 15, 2023, shattered the cockpit of my reality and forced me to look into the eyes of a mystery that no flight manual could explain. On that morning, I was scheduled to die. My name was on the flight manifest. My uniform was pressed and hanging on the door of my rented apartment in the outskirts of Milan. My destiny, statistically and logically, was to be strapped into the left-hand seat of an Airbus A320neo, Flight ITA 824, bound for Rome. I should have been the one to push the throttles to takeoff power at 7:15 a.m. I should have been the one fighting the controls 6 minutes later, when the high-pressure compressor in the right engine disintegrated due to microscopic metal fatigue. I should have been the one screaming into the voice recorder as the aircraft shuddered, rolled, and plummeted into a field near Varese. But I was not there. Instead, Stefano Mancini, a good man and a father of 3, sat in my seat and died in my place. And the reason I am alive to tell you this story, the reason I am breathing while 118 souls are gone, is because a 15-year-old boy who died of leukemia in 2006 stood in my bedroom and told me not to go. To understand the magnitude of this intervention, you must first understand the man I had become before that night. In the aviation industry, we speak of human factors, the psychological and physiological states that affect a pilot's performance. By the summer of 2023, my human factors were catastrophic. Outwardly, I was Captain Fortuna, the senior pilot with over 15,000 flight hours, the man who could land a heavy jet in a crosswind with surgical precision. I wore my 4 stripes with an arrogance that bordered on pathology. I walked through terminals with my chin up, dragging my flight bag, acknowledging the ground staff with a curt nod, fully convinced that I was the master of my own universe. Inwardly, however, I was a hollow shell, a structure eaten away by termites, waiting for the first strong wind to topple me. My spiritual death had preceded my near-physical death by many years. My wife, Francesca, had watched this slow decay with the patience of a saint, but even saints have their limits. We had met in our 20s, bonded by a shared Catholic faith that I had long since discarded as a relic of a superstitious childhood. As my career soared, my soul grounded. I replaced the rosary with navigation charts. I replaced Sunday Mass with layovers in foreign hotels. I replaced God with the autopilot. Francesca used to tell me, during those late-night arguments that left the air in our home thick with resentment, that I trusted the avionics more than I trusted the Creator. She was right. The avionics provided data. God provided silence. Or so I thought. The collapse of my personal life was a cliché, the kind of story you read in tabloids and dismiss as the behavior of a weak man. And I was weak. In early 2022, I began an affair with Valentina, a flight attendant 15 years my junior. It started as a flirtation in the galleys, a way to boost an ego that was already inflated but paradoxically fragile. It evolved into a double life that exhausted me. Valentina was vibrant, unburdened by the history of a 20-year marriage or the complexities of raising teenagers. She was my escape. But escapes are temporary. and the landing is always harder than the takeoff. When Francesca discovered the messages on my phone in March of 2023, the explosion was nuclear. There was no screaming, which somehow made it worse. There was just a cold, devastating clarity. She asked me to leave. My children, Marco, who was 17 and preparing for university, and Sophia, my 14-year-old princess, who used to look at me as if I hung the moon, stopped speaking to me. Marco looked at me with a mixture of anger and disappointment that cut deeper than any knife. Sophia just cried and locked her door. I was exiled from the home we had built together, forced into a sterile, furnished apartment near Malpensa Airport. By June, I was living in a haze of depression and alcohol. The apartment was a testament to my failure. It was clean but soulless, filled with the silence of a man who has driven away everyone who ever loved him. I drank to sleep. I drank to stop thinking about Francesca's face when she told me to pack my bags. I drank to forget the look in Sophia's eyes. And yet, I continued to fly. I was a functioning alcoholic, careful to stop drinking exactly 12 hours before a flight, chugging water and chewing mints, terrified of the random breathalyzer tests, but more terrified of the sobriety that would force me to confront my reflection. The days leading up to June 15th were marked by a suffocating heat wave that had settled over Lombardy. The air was heavy, stagnant, pressing down on the city like a physical weight. On the schedule, I saw the roster. June 15th, flight ITA 824, Milano Linate to Roma Fiumicino, departing 07:15. It was a milk run. A route I had flown more than 300 times. It should have been routine. A quick hop down the peninsula, a coffee in Rome, and a flight back. But as the date approached, a strange anxiety began to take root in my chest. It wasn't the usual stress of the divorce or the fatigue of the lifestyle. This was different. It was a primal dread, a biological alarm bell ringing in the back of my lizard brain. On the night of June 14th, I sat in my small living room, staring at the bottle of scotch on the table. The television was on, muted, casting flickering blue shadows on the walls. I felt like an animal sensing an earthquake before the ground begins to shake. I attributed it to guilt. I attributed it to the impending legal battle over custody and assets. I attributed it to anything but the truth. I poured a drink, then another. I looked at the photo of my family I still kept in my wallet, a picture from a vacation in Sicily 3 years prior, before the rot had set in. We were smiling, standing against a railing with the sea behind us. Francesca looked beautiful. Marco and Sophia looked happy. I looked like a man who didn't know he was holding a grenade with the pin pulled. I put the photo away and finished the glass. The protocols demanded I stop drinking, but the pain demanded I continue. I compromised, stopping earlier than usual, driven by a flicker of professional responsibility that still survived amidst the wreckage of my character. I went to bed at 11:00 p.m., tossing and turning in the unfamiliar sheets. The air conditioning hummed, a monotonous drone that usually lulled me to sleep, but that night it sounded like a warning siren. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by dreams I couldn't remember, but which left me waking up with a racing heart, gasping for air. At 4:30 a.m., the room was pitch black. I was awake, staring at the ceiling, dreading the alarm that was set for 5:00 a.m. I needed to shower, dress, and catch the crew shuttle. I lay there, calculating the flight time, the fuel load, the weather report, trying to anchor myself in the logistics of the job. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a visual change, not at first. It was a change in pressure, similar to what happens in the cabin when the pressurization system engages. But this was spiritual pressure. The air became thick, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The silence of the apartment, usually empty and lonely, suddenly felt full. Someone was there. My first instinct was fear. I thought of intruders. I sat up quickly, reaching for the lamp on the nightstand, my heart hammering against my ribs. But before my hand could find the switch, I saw him. Standing at the foot of my bed was a young man. He was not transparent. He was not glowing with an ethereal light like in the movies. He looked solid, real, three-dimensional. He was wearing modern clothes, a pair of jeans, sneakers, and a polo shirt layered over a t-shirt. He had curly dark hair and a pleasant, open face. He looked like any teenager you might see walking down the streets of Milan, perhaps a friend of my son Marco. But the stillness he possessed was unnatural. He was watching me with a gaze that was both incredibly intense and profoundly peaceful. I froze. My pilot's brain, trained to analyze threats and react, short-circuited. I blinked, expecting the hallucination to vanish, attributing it to the residual alcohol or the stress. But he remained. The details were hyper-realistic. The texture of his hair, the slight reflection of the streetlights in his eyes, the logo on his shirt. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice cracking. "How did you get in here?" The boy did not move, but his expression softened. He didn't look like an intruder. He looked like a messenger who had been waiting for a very long time. "Captain Alessandro," he said. His voice was melodic, calm, yet it carried an authority that commanded absolute attention. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, resonating in the small room. "Do not board Flight 824 today." The specificity of the command hit me like a physical blow. He knew my name. He knew the flight number. "What?" I asked, swinging my legs out of bed, adrenaline flooding my system. "Who sent you? Is this a joke? I'm calling the police." "My name is Carlo Acutis," the boy replied, unperturbed by my aggression. "I died on October 12, 2006, at the age of 15, from fulminant leukemia at the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza. I was born in London on May 3, 1991. I was beatified in Assisi on October 10, 2020. I stared at him, my mouth agape. The name rang a distant bell, perhaps a headline I had scrolled past, or something Francesca had mentioned during her prayers. But the absurdity of the statement was overwhelming. A dead boy? Standing in my rented apartment in 2023? "You're hallucinating, Alessandro," I whispered to myself, rubbing my eyes violently. "You're losing your mind. The stress has finally broken you." "You are not hallucinating, and you are not insane," Carlo said, answering a thought I hadn't spoken aloud. He took a step closer. "I am here because your wife, Francesca, has stormed heaven with her prayers. She has not asked for your return to the house. She has asked for the salvation of your soul. And today, your soul and your body are in immediate danger." The mention of Francesca pierced my defenses. "Leave my wife out of this. If you're a burglar, take the watch on the dresser and get out." Carlo shook his head slowly, a gesture of infinite patience. "Alessandro, listen to me. At 7:21 a.m., exactly 6 minutes after takeoff, the number 2 engine of your aircraft will suffer a catastrophic uncontained failure. The high-pressure compressor has a fatigue crack that the maintenance crews missed. It is invisible to the naked eye, deep within the alloy. When the turbine shatters, it will sever the hydraulic lines and puncture the fuel tank. The wing will catch fire. You will lose all control surfaces. The plane will crash in a field near Varese. There will be no survivors." The technical precision of his warning chilled me to the bone. He didn't say, "The plane will break." He spoke of the high-pressure compressor. He spoke of uncontained failure. These were terms that only a pilot or an engineer would know. "That's impossible," I argued, my skepticism warring with the palpable reality of his presence. "That's an A320neo. It's practically new. The maintenance protocols are rigorous. We check the engines." "Human eyes are limited, Alessandro. Metal fatigue cares nothing for your protocols." Carlo interrupted gently. "You have two choices. You can dismiss me as a phantom of your guilty conscience, put on your uniform, and board that plane. If you do, you will die today. You will die in a state of mortal sin, estranged from your family and from God. Or you can trust in a mercy you do not believe you deserve." I stood up, my legs trembling. I wanted to touch him, to prove he was solid, but I was paralyzed by a fear that was transforming into awe. Why me? Why save me? I'm not a good man. I've betrayed my wife. I've ignored my children. Because God does not look at who you are now, but who you can become, Carlo said. He smiled then, a smile that seemed to illuminate the dark corners of the room. "And because your daughter, Sophia, is crying right now in her sleep." I looked at the digital clock. It was 4:47 a.m. "Sophia," I whispered. "She is having a nightmare," Carlo continued. "She sees the plane falling. She sees the fire. She is waking up now, terrified. She will call you in exactly 1 hour, at 5:47 a.m. She will beg you not to fly. She will tell you she dreamed of your death." He looked me directly in the eyes, his gaze piercing through the layers of cynicism I had built over decades. "When she calls, Alessandro, do not harden your heart. Use her fear as your reason. Call operations. Tell them you have a family emergency. Request medical leave for stress. Do not get on that plane." "And if I don't go? Someone else will fly it," I said, the realization dawning on me. Stefano Mancini is the reserve. He has kids." Carlo's face grew solemn. "We cannot control the free will of others or the unfolding of all physical laws in this broken world. Stefano's path is his own, and God will be with him. But your path, today, offers a junction. You are being given a chance to repair the wreckage of your family before you repair any aircraft. If you board Flight 824, you destroy not just your body, but the last hope for your wife and children to heal. If you stay, the tragedy will still happen, but it will be the catalyst for your resurrection." I sank back onto the bed, burying my face in my hands. This is insane. This is completely insane. When I looked up, the room was empty. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. The air still felt charged. I sat there, shivering in the warm night, staring at the empty space where the boy had stood. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A vivid dream? A psychotic break? I stood up and walked to the spot where he had been. The carpet fibers were depressed, as if someone had actually stood there. There was a faint scent in the air, not the stale smell of the apartment, but something fresh, like lilies or incense, crisp and clean. I looked at the clock. 4:55 a.m. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror, the dark circles under my eyes, the gray stubble. "Get a grip, Alessandro," I told my reflection. "You are a captain. You have a flight to command." I started my routine mechanically. I shaved. I brushed my teeth. I put on my crisp white shirt and tied my tie. I was trying to override the experience with ritual. I convinced myself it was a stress-induced hallucination. I was ready to leave. I grabbed my flight bag and my hat. I looked at my phone. 5:46 a.m. It won't happen, I muttered. Sophia won't call. It was just a dream. I stood by the door, hand on the handle, waiting. The seconds ticked by on the wall clock. 5:46, 58, 5:46, 59, 5:47, 00. My phone rang. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. I stared at the screen. The name Sophia flashed in bright letters. My heart stopped. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the device. I slid my thumb across the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Papa?" Her voice was small, broken, choked with sobs. It was the voice of my little girl, stripped of the teenage anger of the last few months. "Sophia, tesoro, what is it?" "It's early," I said, my voice trembling. "Papa, please." She was hyperventilating. "Please come home. Please don't fly today. I had a dream. It was so real. You were in the plane, and it was burning. The wing fell off. Please, Papa. I'm so scared." I leaned against the door frame, sliding down until I hit the floor. The prophecy was unfolding exactly as the boy had said. The specificity of her dream, the fire. The wing mirrored the boy's technical description of the compressor failure. "Sophia, listen to me," I said, tears welling up in my eyes for the first time in years. "Breathe. It was just a nightmare." "No!" she screamed. "It wasn't just a nightmare. I know it. Please, Papa. If you love me, don't go. Just come home. Mom is awake too. She's trying to calm me down, but I can't. I can't lose you." In the background, I heard Francesca's voice, soothing but worried. "Alessandro?" Sophia woke up screaming. "She's hysterical. She says you're going to die." Hearing Francesca's voice broke the last dam of my resistance. The boy, Carlo, was right. This was my off-ramp. This was the intervention. I looked at my flight bag, at the stripes on my shoulder, symbols of the identity I had worshipped. And then I looked at the phone, the link to the people I had abandoned. "Francesca," I said, my voice firm for the first time that morning. "Tell Sophia I'm not flying. Tell her I'm coming over. Right now. You are." Francesca sounded stunned. "But the flight." "To hell with the flight," I said. "I'm calling operations. I'm taking emergency leave. I'll be there in 40 minutes. I hung up. My hands were still shaking, but a strange calm was settling over me. I dialed the crew's scheduling number. "This is Captain Fortuna," I said when the dispatcher answered. "I have a severe family medical emergency. I cannot command Flight 824. You need to activate the reserve immediately." "Captain, it's very late notice," the dispatcher complained. "Captain Mancini is on standby, but this will cause a delay." "I don't care about the delay," I snapped. "I am unfit to fly. My daughter is in crisis. Call Mancini." I threw my phone onto the couch and sat there in the silence of the apartment. I had done it. I had grounded myself. I took off my tie and threw it across the room. I unbuttoned my collar. I felt naked, stripped of my purpose, yet strangely light. I didn't know yet that the clock was ticking down for Stefano. I didn't know that in less than 2 hours, the world would be watching breaking news reports from a field in Varese. I sat there, waiting, holding the image of the boy in the sneakers and the Road to Holiness t-shirt in my mind, wondering if I had just saved my life or ended my career for a hallucination. But deep down, as the sun began to rise over Milan, painting the sky in hues of blood, orange and violet, I knew. I knew that the laws of physics were about to be suspended, or perhaps superseded by a higher law that I was only just beginning to learn. I drove to the house in a trance, the city of Milan waking up around me in a blur of gray concrete and pale morning light. My hands gripped the steering wheel with such force that my knuckles turned white, mirroring the pallor of the uniform shirt I still wore, now unbuttoned at the collar and devoid of its tie. The radio was off. I could not bear the cheerful banter of morning DJs or the mundane traffic updates while the countdown in my head ticked away, the seconds to a tragedy I alone knew was coming. Every red light felt like an accusation. Every clear stretch of road felt like a runway. When I pulled into the driveway of the family home, a modest, two-story villa with ivy climbing the trellis that I had pruned myself 3 summers ago, it was 6:40 a.m. The house looked exactly as it had the day I left, a monument to a life that had continued without me. I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the silence, the heat of the engine block ticking in the cool morning air. I felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting his own history. The front door opened before I could knock. Francesca stood there, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was drawn, etched with the lines of sleepless nights I had caused, but her eyes held a frantic relief. Behind her, in the shadows of the hallway, stood Sophia. My daughter looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes red and swollen, clutching a throw pillow to her chest as if it were a shield. "You came," Francesca said, her voice flat, guarding herself against the hope that I was actually staying. "I told you I would," I replied, stepping over the threshold. The scent of the house hit me, coffee, lavender laundry detergent, and the faint, sweet smell of brioche. It was the scent of safety, and it nearly brought me to my knees. Sophia didn't speak. She dropped the pillow and ran to me, slamming into my chest with the force of a collision. I wrapped my arms around her, burying my face in her hair. She was shaking, vibrating with the aftershocks of a terror I now understood was not a dream, but a premonition. "It felt so real, Papa," she sobbed into my shirt. "I saw the fire. I saw the ground coming up." "I'm here, Sophia. I'm here on the ground," I whispered, stroking her hair, my eyes squeezing shut against the burning tears. "I'm not going anywhere." We moved into the kitchen, the heart of the home. Marco was there, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal he hadn't touched. He looked at me with his usual guarded hostility, but today it was tempered by confusion. He saw his sister crying, his mother pale, and his father usually the stoic captain looking like a shipwreck survivor. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, a truce in the face of an unknown crisis. I sat at the table, refusing the coffee Francesca offered. I couldn't swallow. I placed my phone on the table, face up. "Why?" Francesca asked, leaning against the counter, studying me. "You never miss a flight, Alessandro. Not for fevers, not for anniversaries. Why today?" I couldn't tell her. Not yet. I couldn't tell her that a beatified teenager had stood in my bedroom. It sounded like madness, and right now, I needed to be the anchor they thought I was. I couldn't," I stammered, glancing at the digital clock on the microwave. 7:14 a.m. "Stefano is flying it," I said, my voice barely audible. "Stefano Mancini." "He's a good pilot," Marco said, breaking his silence. "You've said so yourself." "He is," I agreed, "the best." I unlocked my phone and opened the flight tracking application I used to monitor routes. My thumb hovered over the search bar, trembling, before I typed in AZ824. The screen refreshed. The status changed from scheduled to taxiing. "Papa, stop looking at it," Sophia pleaded, wiping her eyes. "You're safe. That's all that matters." "I have to look," I said. "I have to know." 7:15 a.m. On the screen, The small yellow icon representing the Airbus A320 began to move along the runway at Linate. I closed my eyes, and I was there. I was in the cockpit. I could feel the rumble of the wheels on the tarmac, the surge of acceleration as Stefano pushed the thrust levers to toga takeoff, go around power. I knew the checklist he was running in his head. V1. Rotate. The icon lifted off the map. Takeoff. He's in the air, I whispered. The kitchen was silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Francesca was watching me with growing alarm, sensing that this was not just a panic attack, but a vigil. 7:18 a.m. The aircraft was climbing through 2,000 feet, banking south. It was following the standard departure procedure. Everything was normal. Logic began to whisper in my ear again. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe the boy was just a projection of my guilt. Maybe Stefano will land in Rome in 50 minutes, and I will have thrown away my career for a nightmare. But the air in the kitchen felt heavy, charged with the same static pressure I had felt in my apartment. 7:20 a.m. Alessandro, you're scaring the children, Francesca said softly. Put the phone away. 1 more minute, I said. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just 1 more minute. 7:21 a.m. On the screen, the aircraft icon was over the outskirts of Milan, climbing past 4,000 feet. The telemetry showed the speed increasing. And then it stopped. The altitude reading froze. The speed reading fluctuated wildly, the 100 knots, 280, 150. No, I breathed. What? Marco stood up, sensing the shift in the room. I stared at the screen. The icon didn't vanish immediately. It spun. The altitude numbers began to unwind rapidly. 3,800. 3,200. 2,500. In my mind, I saw what Carlo Acutis had described. The microscopic crack in the high-pressure compressor of the number 2 engine giving way. The violent explosion of the turbine blades, shrapnel tearing through the engine cowling like bullets through paper, the severance of the hydraulic lines, the blue blood of the aircraft spraying out, rendering the flight controls useless, the fuel line rupturing, the spark. He's falling, I said, my voice devoid of emotion, detached by shock. He's lost the right engine. He's lost hydraulics. Alessandro! Francesca shouted, stepping forward to grab the phone. Look! I pointed at the screen with a shaking finger. Look at the altitude. 200 feet, 800 feet, 0 feet. The signal was lost. The yellow plane icon turned gray and stopped moving in a field just southeast of Varese. I dropped the phone. It clattered loudly on the wooden table. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, Marco's phone buzzed. Then, Francesca's. Then, mine began to ring. It was the crew scheduling desk again. Marco picked up his phone, his face draining of all color as he read the notification. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horror that would never leave him. Papa, he whispered. Breaking news. Sky TG-24. An airplane. An airplane has gone down near San Donato. Sophia screamed. It was a primal sound, a release of the terror she had been holding back. She covered her ears and curled into a ball on her chair. Francesca gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, staring at me as if I were a stranger, or a prophet, or a monster. It's 8:24, I said, staring at the wall, seeing nothing but the face of Stefano Mancini. Stefano is dead. They're all dead. I stood up, the chair scraping violently against the floor. I felt the need to vomit, to run, to scream. I walked to the sink and gripped the edge of the counter, bowing my head. How did you know? Francesca's voice was a whisper, trembling with fear. She wasn't looking at the news. She was looking at me. Alessandro, how did you know exactly when? I turned to face them. The morning sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, indifferent to the catastrophe that had just occurred 10 miles away. I looked at my wife, at my son, at my weeping daughter. I was alive. I was standing in my kitchen. My heart was beating. I didn't know, I said, my voice breaking as the tears finally came, hot and blinding. A boy told me. A boy who died 17 years ago told me. The phone on the table continued to ring, the screen lighting up with the name of the chief pilot. But I didn't answer. I walked over to Sophia and pulled her into my arms, holding her so tight that I could feel her heartbeat syncing with mine. I looked over her head at Francesca, and for the first time in years, I didn't see judgment in her eyes. I saw awe. And I saw the terrifying realization that the universe was far larger and far stranger than either of us had ever dared to believe. "We have to pray," Francesca said, her voice shaking but resolute. She reached for the rosary beads that hung from a hook by the window, the ones I used to mock. "For Stefano, for his family. We have to pray." I nodded, unable to speak. I fell to my knees on the kitchen floor, dragging Sophia down with me, not out of piety, but out of the sheer, crushing weight of gratitude and guilt. As I knelt there, the siren of a distant ambulance wailing in the morning air, I realized that my life as Captain Fortuna, the master of the sky, was over. And something else, something terrifyingly fragile and necessary, had just begun. The days that followed the crash of Flight ITA 824 were a blur of flashing blue lights, aggressive microphones, and the sterile gray walls of interrogation rooms. I became known in the press as the Miracle Pilot, a moniker that tasted like ash in my mouth every time I heard it. The world wanted a hero, or at least a mystic, someone who had foreseen the tragedy through some latent psychic ability. They didn't want the truth, that a drunk, adulterous man had been saved by a teenage saint while a good father took his place in the inferno. I sat before the ANSV investigators, the Italian National Agency for the Safety of Flight 3 days after the accident. The room was cold, lit by harsh fluorescent strips that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. They played the cockpit voice recorder tape. I had to listen to Stefano's final moments. I heard the calm, professional way he called out the failure. I heard the master warning chime. I heard the sickening crunch of the turbine disintegration, a sound exactly like the one Carlo Acutis had described in my bedroom. And I heard Stefano's last word, whispered a split second before impact. "Elena." "Captain Fortuna," the lead investigator said, sliding a report across the metal table. "The preliminary analysis confirms a fatigue crack in the high-pressure compressor disc of the number 2 engine. It was undetectable by standard line maintenance. It was a ticking time bomb. You called in sick 40 minutes before departure, citing a severe family emergency. How did you know?" I looked at the men in their suits, men of science and data, just as I had been. I could have told them about the boy in the sneakers. I could have told them about the spiritual pressure in the room. Instead, I gave them the only answer their secular minds could process, which happened to be a partial truth. "I didn't know," I said, my voice rasping from days of silence. I had a breakdown. I looked at my daughter, and I couldn't leave. It was a coincidence, a statistical anomaly. They didn't believe me, of course, but they couldn't prove otherwise. They suspended my license pending a psychological evaluation, a formality that was entirely unnecessary. I had already grounded myself permanently. I would never touch the controls of an aircraft again. The sky, once my sanctuary, had become a graveyard I was not permitted to enter. The hardest part was not the investigation. It was the funeral. A week later, under a weeping gray sky, I stood at the back of the basilica in Rome. The nave was packed with uniformed crews, a sea of navy blue and gold stripes. I wore a dark civilian suit. I felt like a deserter attending the memorial of the soldier who died covering his retreat. When the service ended, I forced myself to walk toward the front. I needed to see Elena, Stefano's widow. She was standing by the casket, clutching the flag they had folded for her. Her eyes were hollowed out by grief. When she saw me, the crowd parted. A hush fell over the gathered pilots. They expected a confrontation, perhaps a scream of accusation. "Alessandro," she said softly. "Elena?" I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I am so sorry. It should have been me. I swear to God, it should have been me." She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something I didn't know if I possessed. Then she did the unthinkable. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was cold, but firm. "Stefano told me once that you were the best stick and rudder man he knew," she whispered. "He respected you. We cannot trade lives, Ale. God doesn't work like a bank exchange. You are here. He is there. Do not waste the time you stole." Her mercy broke me more completely than her anger ever could have. I left the church and walked for hours through the rain-slicked streets of Rome, finally understanding the weight of the second chance I had been given. It was not a gift of happiness. It was a burden of responsibility. I returned to Milan, to the house I had been exiled from. The reconciliation with Francesca was not a movie ending. There were no sweeping orchestral swells or instant forgiveness. It was a slow, painful excavation of the ruins we had created. I moved into the guest room. We started therapy. I stopped drinking, cold turkey, attending AA meetings in a church basement where I introduced myself simply as Alessandro, a man who had lost his way. Valentina, the mistress, vanished from my life with a single text message. I didn't mourn the loss. She was a symptom of a disease that had been cured by shock therapy. My focus narrowed to the three people inside those walls. I learned to listen to Marco, really listen, sitting through his angry silences until he finally began to trust that I wouldn't leave again. I sat with Sophia while she did her homework, just being present, a sentinel against the nightmares that still plagued her. 6 months after the crash, on a crisp October morning, Francesca and I drove to Assisi. It was a pilgrimage she had wanted to make for years, and one I had always scorned as touristy superstition. We walked into the sanctuary of the Spoliation, where the tomb of blessed Carlo Acutis lay. I approached the viewing glass. There he was, the boy from my bedroom. He looked exactly the same. The jeans, the sneakers, the peaceful face that seemed to be merely sleeping. Seeing him in the physical world, encased in glass, sent a jolt of electricity through me that nearly buckled my knees. It was the final confirmation, the closing of the circle. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my captain's wings, the gold pin with the laurel wreath, and the star that I had worn on my chest for 20 years. It represented my identity, my pride, my mastery over the physical laws. I knelt by the tomb and placed the wings on the floor, leaving them there in the shadows. "Thank you," I whispered, the words inadequate, but sincere. "I am grounded now, but I am finally home." Francesca placed her hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in a decade, the touch didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like a partnership. Life moved on. I didn't return to aviation. Instead, I took a job teaching mathematics at a local liceo. The pay was a fraction of a captain's salary, and the students were unruly. But I found a strange peace in the logic of numbers, in the absolute truths of calculus that didn't require life-or-death decisions at 30,000 feet. I became the faculty advisor for the astronomy club, teaching kids to look up at the sky with wonder rather than the arrogance of conquest. One evening, a year after the crash, I was sitting on the patio with Francesca. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in the same brilliant oranges and purples that I used to see from the cockpit window. Sophia was inside practicing the piano, a halting melody that drifted through the open door. Marco was in the driveway washing his first car. I looked at my wife. The lines of stress had softened around her eyes. We were not the same people we were before June 15th. We were scarred, welded back together by the heat of a near-miss catastrophe. "Do you miss it?" she asked, catching me looking at a contrail high overhead, a silver needle threading the atmosphere. I watched the plane until it disappeared behind the roofline. I thought about the checklist, the thrust, the power. And then I thought about the empty seat at Stefano Mancini's dinner table. I thought about the boy in the sneakers who had stepped through the veil of eternity to tell me to stop running. "No," I said, taking a sip of sparkling water. "I don't miss the view from up there. The view from down here is much clearer." I took her hand, interlacing our fingers. The altimeter of my soul finally read 0, grounded and stable. The turbulence was behind me. I was just a man, sitting in a garden, grateful for the breath in my lungs and the grace I had never earned, but would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. The garden was my sanctuary, but the field in Varese remained my courtroom. Despite the peace I had cultivated in the classroom and the quiet rhythms of my rehabilitated marriage, there was one final vector I had to fly on last waypoint I had avoided navigating. The history until now speaks of my resignation and my pilgrimage to Assisi, but it glosses over the scar on the earth itself. To truly conclude this logbook, to sign off as Captain Fortuna for the last time, I had to stand on the soil where Stefano died. It was June 15th, 2024. Exactly 1 year after the crash. The municipality had erected a simple stone monument near the impact site, a slab of granite etched with 118 names. The ceremony was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. The heat was identical to the day of the disastrous, suffocating, humid blanket that pressed down on the Lombard plain. I drove the car, Francesca beside me, her hand resting lightly on my knee. We were silent. Marco and Sophia had wanted to come, but I had asked them to stay behind. This was a duty for the man who should have been in the cockpit, not for the children who had kept him out of it. When we arrived, the police had cordoned off the access road. A crowd had gathered, families of the victims, local officials, and a phalanx of journalists. I parked the car and stepped out, immediately assaulted by the flashbulbs. They recognized me, of course, the miracle pilot, the man who sensed the danger. I kept my head down, wearing sunglasses to hide eyes that had seen things no flight recorder could capture. We walked toward the monument, moving through the crowd like ghosts. The atmosphere was heavy with a collective grief that felt physical, a dense fog of sorrow. I saw the faces of the bereaved mothers clutching photos, fathers staring blankly at the horizon. I felt a surge of nausea. My miracle was their tragedy. My salvation was their loss. The guilt, which I had managed to tame into a dull ache over the last 12 months, flared up into a sharp, stabbing pain. Why me? The question hammered in my chest. Why was my sin forgiven and Stefano's virtue extinguished? We reached the front of the crowd just as the bishop began the blessing. And there she was, Elena Mancini. She stood in the front row, flanked by her 3 children. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 10, was wearing a pilot's cap, Stefano's cap. It was too big for him, sliding down over his forehead. The sight of it nearly brought me to my knees. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to retreat, to go back to my garden, to my safe, grounded life. But then I felt it again, that shift in pressure, that distinct electrostatic charge in the air. I looked to my right. Standing at the edge of the police tape, unnoticed by the weeping crowd, was the boy, Carlo. He was wearing the same jeans, the same polo shirt, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at me this time. He was looking at the monument, his expression one of profound, sorrowful compassion. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a reminder that the line between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a veil, and it is thinner than the aluminum skin of an aircraft. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the summer grass and the lingering incense from the bishop's thurible. I squeezed Francesca's hand and stepped forward, breaking protocol, moving into the open space between the crowd and the stone. Elena turned. Her eyes widened when she saw me. The silence in the field deepened, the only sound the rustle of the cornstalks in the wind. "Elena," I said, my voice carrying in the stillness. She didn't pull away. She looked at me with a strength that humbled me. I walked until I was standing directly in front of her and her children. I knelt down, not to the monument, but to the boy wearing the oversized cap. I was on the same eye level as him. "Your father," I said, my voice trembling, "was the bravest man I ever knew. He fought for you until the very last second. He didn't lose that plane. The plane lost him." The boy looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears, and nodded. I stood up and faced Elena. "I carry his memory every day," I whispered. "I am living the life he should have had. I promise you, I will not waste a single hour of it." Elena stepped forward and embraced me. It was a public absolution, a signal to the crowd and to the universe that the debt was carried, if not paid. "Live for him, Alessandro," she whispered into my ear. "Just live." As we pulled apart, I looked back toward the edge of the field. Carlo was gone. The pressure had normalized. The air was just air. But the heaviness in my chest had evaporated, replaced by a clarity as sharp as a cloudless sky at 30,000 feet. We left the ceremony an hour later. The drive home was different. The silence wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. I rolled down the window, letting the wind hit my face. I thought about the physics of flight lift, weight, thrust, and drag. For 20 years, I had believed that if I balanced those forces, I could control my destiny. I was wrong. The only force that mattered was grace, and it was the only one you couldn't calculate. That evening, I sat on my patio again, the scene merging with the peace I had found in the garden. Marco was washing his car. Sophia was playing the piano, the domestic symphony of a second chance. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at the date. June 15th was ending. I had survived the anniversary. Francesca came out with 2 glasses of wine. She sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "You did good today," she said softly. "I didn't do anything," I replied, looking up at the first stars appearing in the twilight. "I just showed up." "That's all he asks," she said. I looked at the stars, connecting the dots into constellations: Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, navigation points. I used to use to cross oceans. Now, they were just beautiful lights. I thought of Carlo Acutis, the cyber apostle who had hacked my reality. I thought of Stefano, flying in the eternal blue. I took a sip of the wine, tasting the earth and the fruit, the richness of the soil. I was 48 years old. I was a math teacher. I was a husband and a father. I was a man who had been scheduled to die and was told to stay. Checklist complete, I whispered to the night. Francesca looked at me, puzzled. What? I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached my eyes. I reached over and turned off the patio light, plunging us into the soft, comforting dark. Engine shut down, I said, closing my eyes and listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. Parking brake set. We are home.